Hi everybody, welcome back to the Crime Lab. So today we're going to be talking about the case of Bridget Cleary. So this is less of a serial killer case, more of what actually happened to Bridget, because there's some level of speculation on what happened, and there was somebody committed for it, but part of the commission, part of the person that was convicted, it was based a lot around superstition and kind of what was going on at the time. So Bridget was an Irish woman who was married in 1895. She was born in 1869 in, I'm going to attempt to pronounce this, or Ballyvedlia, County Tipperary in Ireland. She married Michael Cleary about 18 years later in 1887 in a church in Dragon. It's spelled Dragon. And they had met roughly a month earlier in Clonmel, where he was what's called a cooper. So he was somebody that made stuff like barrels and coffins and like stuff out of wood. So probably some chairs, tables, that sort of thing as well. And she was actually an apprentice to a dressmaker, which was not an uncommon trade for women at the time to be like dressmakers, sometimes hat makers, um, you know, stuff specializing in womanly goods. And at the time of her death, they had never had any children. Um, and shortly after the wedding, Bridget returned to her hometown of Ballyvedlia. And if there's anybody from Ireland watching, feel free to tell me if I am pronouncing that wildly incorrectly and throw it in the comments how I'm supposed to pronounce it. So they returned home and she lived with her parents while Michael continued working as a cooper. And during this time, she was actually gaining her independence a little more because they were separated for a little bit of this time. And so she was getting chickens and she was actually making money by selling the eggs of her chickens. And I wouldn't be shocked if there's the occasional time where when she butchered some chickens, she would actually sell the meat. That was not uncommon either if people had flocks of chickens back then. So then later on, while she was living with her family and gaining a little bit more independence, she actually got a sewing machine and continued working as a dress and hat maker, trying to supplement her income a little bit while she was doing this. And then during this time, while she was living with her family, her mother unfortunately passed away. And as was with the times, Bridget and her husband Michael then took kind of, I guess, custody or took over responsibility for her elderly dad, which helped actually get them housing, because he was a laborer for a long time. And so at the time they were entitled a certain level of housing. But the house that they were actually given the ability to utilize, they had no interest in it because, again, as was common for the time, this was the late 1800s, it was claimed to be built on a fairy ring fort, which, if I understand correctly from looking into that, it's kind of like a fairy portal or a fairy trap. So it's kind of meant to like trap people and therefore kind of allow fairies to cause issue or kind of lay claim to different things. So during this time, there was some issues within the marriage between Bridget and Michael. In March of 1895, so this would have been about 8 years after they were married, Bridget is reported missing. And she had been ill with bronchitis, so not a lot of people had really seen her as it was. Like, they had family and close friends visiting to help care for her, but she had not really been seen out of the house too often due to her illness. And so they had some doctors visiting after about a week of her being ill. A doctor visited and determined that she was very, very ill, more ill than they had originally thought, and actually had told them, hey, you need to have a priest visit to do final rites. Kind of like what you hear for people that are in the hospital that are terminal, that are on hospice, end of life sort of thing. It's not uncommon to have a priest or a pastor or somebody from the clergy, whatever religion they find comfort in, kind of for lack of a better word, phrase that I can think of right now, to give like final rites or do what they have to do at the end of life, as is part of their religion. So as I said, she had kind of been attended by family and close friends during this time while she was sick. So they were trying a lot of home remedies, and during this time she was actually accused of being a fairy, which, again, this was kind of pre more modern times, so fairies and witches were not unheard of. You know, there's the stories of changelings, you know, fairies coming into somebody's home, stealing a newborn, leaving a changeling. You know, those stories were still very rampant at the time. And so she was accused of being a fairy. And because of this, urine was thrown on her, and she was actually brought out in front of the fireplace for the fairy that was utilizing her body, or that had kind of, again, in a matter of speaking, possessed her, to be drawn out. So then March 16th comes around, and rumors began to circulate that she was missing. And because these rumors had progressively, the rumblings about it had become louder and louder, the police began to investigate. And when Michael was asked, he said that they were holding vigils and just waiting for, and saying that the fairies had taken her captive. And so Bridget's body was found in a shallow grave on March 22nd. So about 6 days, my bad, after the initial reports and initial investigations, she was found in a shallow grave, and her body was actually reported to have been burned. And with the initial investigation and initial talking to people, 9 people were accused of her murder. So there comes the trial, beginning of April. So April 1st through the 6th, roughly, was when the trial initial hearings were beginning. And then the actual court began in July, in front of a grand jury. So they indicted 5 people of murder: Michael, her husband, her dad, Patrick, Mary and James Kennedy, and Patrick Kennedy, which I believe were close friends. So then there was more evidence actually showing Michael had summoned Father Ryan back on March 15th. So just before she had actually been reported missing. So then Ryan found Bridget alive but agitated. So the pastor that had come, pastor or priest. And then Michael told the priest that he hadn't been giving his wife medicine because he didn't have faith in it. He thought that modern medicine at the time just shouldn't be used. So then the priest gave them communion. The family returned, and arguments again were ensued with fairy mythology, claiming fairies were somehow involved in Bridget's sickness, or that she had been taken by fairies, and who they were seeing in front of them was not Bridget. So then Bridget then, of course, told Michael during this argument the only person that had been taken by fairies was his mother. So then she was then force-fed and thrown on the floor, and then her skirt, when she was thrown on the floor, her skirt caught fire. She was apparently pretty close to either the fireplace or like the cooking stove. And during all of this, Michael decided to throw oil on her, which, of course, as a lot of us know, oil makes fire catch faster and it burn a lot more. So then during the trial, the jury's brought to the building where her body was being kept for viewing to see the full extent of her injuries. So Patrick, Michael, and James were all sentenced for wounding Bridget and were given various sentences. And then Patrick, her dad, was given 6 months of hard labor because it was found that all of them were guilty to some extent. And then Michael, her husband, was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years. So he was given the full extent of what they could kind of do at the time. He spent 15 years in prison in Maryborough and released on April 28th of 1910. And then he moved to Liverpool, then Canada, all in the same year. So all in 1910. And of course, during this time, there was not television, nor the extent of like radio as we have today. But newspapers and articles like that were very common. And so because of the gruesome nature of this particular crime, it was covered by a whole slew of newspapers and different reporters from not only across Ireland, but a good chunk of the UK and elsewhere. So like I said, this was not necessarily one of my typical serial killer videos. This was just one that I kind of found a little interesting because it involves mythology a little bit more with the fairy mythology, which is very common around Europe. You hear the Brothers Grimms from Germany involving fairies. You hear it all over the UK, Ireland, and Scotland. Pretty much every culture, I think, has some version of a like fairy mythology or fairy legend. So I always kind of find that fun when different crime cases have some level of the mythology of that culture brought into it. No matter how gruesome, like I know a lot of these crimes are very gruesome, but yeah, I find it interesting all the time. But if anybody has any questions, concerns, suggestions for future videos, feel free to leave them down in the comments, and have a great day, everybody.